All right, this lecture will continue our overview of King's arguments and letter from a Birmingham jail. And these are themes that we'll continue to explore as we take up further arguments on violence and disobedience to the state. Today, I want to begin by reviewing some important historical context and background for King's letter from a Birmingham jail. So, in the early 1960s, Black people all over the South had risen up in rebellion and protest. And by the late 1960s, poor Black communities were launching uprisings against poverty and white supremacy. These sort of urban insurrections throughout the country, which finally forced the country to pay attention to the misery created by segregation and racialized economic inequality. Just recall the long hot summer of 1967 that we discussed much earlier in this semester. And also check out the following analysis of the economic conditions which led to those riots in the summer of 1967, right? The text is called the 1968 Kerner Commission Got It Right, but Nobody Listened. And it's at the Smithsonian Magazine. You can find it online. And what I want you to keep in mind is this. All of this Black rebellion and unrest, it took most white folks by surprise. And it sounds strange, but of course white folks were taken by surprise. After all, most white folks lived in desperate ignorance of the institutional racism of the day. They had been, quote, well-adjusted to injustice, as the philosopher Cornel West likes to say. And remember, poll after poll and survey after survey in the middle of the 1960s, right, at the height of the civil rights movement, those polls indicated that many, sometimes a majority, of Northern whites believed that white folks and Black folks did in fact receive separate but equal treatment under the law, when we know now that was anything but the case. And poll after poll indicated that Southern whites, who would often admit that the treatment of Blacks was unequal, they would nonetheless insist that Black folks were perfectly satisfied with their social status in that racialized hierarchy where they were beneath white people. And we look back at them now and think, my God, how could they have been so blind? All of these white people who would look at their world in the middle of Jim Crow and somehow call that equality, or say that Black folks preferred their treatment. But this is what is so important about this historical insight, right? If it's possible that the environment in the day, back in the 60s, could have produced such deeply racially ignorant white people that they could look at the Jim Crow reality and call it equal, right? If our environments have such power over us, well, how do we not know that our contemporary environment hasn't produced a similar sort of racial ignorance in us, such that we think that racism is merely just the problem, let's say, of negative attitudes in the minds of white people and not something that may be built in to the structures and institutions that arrange our society, as many, let's say, most academics who look at the question of race are going to argue. Okay, now, because of their ignorance of the realities of race back in the 60s, right, a significant number of white Americans, they saw these protests and these rebellions happening in the 60s, and they blamed the civil rights era protests on communist organizers who had really encouraged Black people to integrate and manipulated them into revolting. And we'll often hear similar conspiratorial narratives today about Antifa or about communists and Marxists whenever masses of people take to the streets to protest, right? They're often denounced as paid protesters and outside agitators who are stirring up and manipulating people, right? Or the media somehow stirs up and manipulates people to take to the streets. And I just want to encourage you to always be very, very careful about those conspiratorial narratives, right? They always serve a particular function. They seek to erase the genuine grievances that would lead your neighbors to protest and to rebel. And if you can write off the social movement as just a kind of conspiracy, then you don't actually have to listen or engage with the arguments you hear from the streets when people protest. And that was the function of the kind of red baiting, red scare, communist conspiratorial narrative in the 60s, which isn't to suggest there weren't Marxists and communists in the 60s who were part of the civil rights movement, because there were, but they weren't manipulating, right, docile black people into revolt when black people actually preferred their particular status. So instead of addressing the arguments in favor of integration, those narratives committed the fallacies of guilt by association and ad hominem attacks, right, that we reviewed earlier, by demonizing the civil rights protesters or saying they were being manipulated, right, by outsiders instead of actually engaging with their arguments. Now, even if all of this black rebellion of the civil rights movement, even if it took white Americans by surprise, for black Americans who had to suffer the everyday indignities of American racism, revolt was always just minutes away. An individual black person might finally lash out, or a whole neighborhood might rise up in revolt. It would all just depend on some atrocity that finally sparked the rebellion. And that atrocity came in 1954 with the brutal kidnapping and murder of the 14-year-old child, Emmett Till, murdered by 2 white men in Mississippi.
This was our friend laying.
Emmett's mother
like
decided to have an open casket funeral, and she invited the whole city to view her son's mutilated face.
They said that about 1 in every 5 had to be assisted out of the building. They would just go into a faint.
Images of Emmett Till circulated throughout the country, and the murderers were acquitted by an all-white jury, sparking mass rebellion, much like contemporary rebellions in America have been sparked by the murders of Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, Philando Castile, and most recently, George Floyd. 100 days after the acquittal of Emmett Till's murderers, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and MLK becomes a famous public figure in organizing the boycott of the city of Montgomery's buses. And so the modern civil rights movement begins. A wave of protests roll throughout the country. Leaders emerge, movements emerge, marches, freedom rides, sit-ins, voter registration drives, and economic boycotts catapult the country into a revolutionary struggle. And this black freedom struggle is met with fierce opposition. And as you can see, just from the few images here, demonstrating or protesting in the black freedom struggle was often very, very perilous, presenting real dangers from both the police and white mobs. Right here we have an image of some freedom riders. Freedom riders were courageous civil rights activists who would travel throughout the South to demonstrate against the continued segregation of public interstate travel and public rest stops, even though federal laws had desegregated those facilities and institutions. One group of freedom riders stopped outside of Birmingham, Alabama, and the police commissioner, Bull Connor, whom we discussed in the last lecture, allowed a white mob to attack the freedom riders, and the mob proceeded to lock them inside the bus and set it on fire, so that the freedom riders were quite lucky to have escaped out the back with their lives. So because of the danger to protesters from both the state, that is the police, and mobs, the question of whether demonstrators should be armed, and the question of whether they should engage in self-defense during their protests, or whether they should rely on pure nonviolence, which meant non-retaliation, these questions were vigorously debated during the civil rights movement. And it just was not at all obvious to everyone that nonviolent disobedience was the most effective method for oppressed peoples to achieve liberation. Though strategic and philosophical nonviolence is the approach adopted by Martin Luther King that we read about in the letter from Birmingham jail. All right, and so here I think we can kind of turn back to the text. King's arguments and letter from Birmingham jail that we're going to review for this lecture include his critique of the white moderate and the white moderates and King's counter arguments against the white moderates. King's critique of the white moderate and King's counter arguments which defend protest. Also, King's analysis of protest as creative tension, King's argument on just laws versus unjust laws, and King's sort of deconstruction of the good cop, bad cop narrative. And so we'll begin with King's critique of the white moderate. King says the white moderate, one, has a superficial analysis of social problems, two, is more devoted to order than justice, three, prefers a negative peace to a positive peace, four, agrees with the goals of the civil rights movement, but not the methods of achieving those goals, and finally, that the white moderate lives by a mythical concept of time. And so we'll take up these in order, and we'll be able to get through the first three for this lecture. So starting with the white moderate's superficial analysis of social problems. Recall that the clergy argued that we are convinced that the demonstrations are unwise and untimely. They said, we agree with certain local Negro leadership which has called for honest and open negotiation of racial issues in our area. All of us need to find proper channels for its accomplishment. Such actions that incite hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problems. We do not believe that extreme measures are justified in Birmingham, referring to protests as, quote, extreme measures. And we further urge our own Negro community to withdraw support from these demonstrations and to unite locally in working peacefully for a better Birmingham. When rights are consistently denied, a cause should be pressed in the courts and in negotiation among local leaders and not in the streets. We appeal to both our white and Negro citizenry to observe the principles of law and order and common sense. So that's the argument that King's going to respond to with his own counter arguments. And we should note here, maybe first and foremost, is that unlike Martin Luther King Jr., the clergy aren't calling for the end to segregation in Birmingham. And nowhere do they call for justice, right? Rather, they call for unity. And so you want to think about what's the difference between calling for unity and calling for justice, right? It's not an end to racism and segregation that they're arguing for, but really an end to the unrest and racial friction that emerges within the context of protest and demonstrations and social struggle. And so the stated and unstated premises of the white moderates' argument run as follows. The Birmingham protests, even though peaceful, incite hatred and violence. The protests are unwise and untimely. The protests divide instead of unify the community. That one should sound really familiar to rhetoric we still hear today. The protests are an extreme measure, and the protests undermine the negotiation efforts between certain local black leaders and Birmingham city leadership. And on the basis of these premises, the moderates conclude, therefore, the Birmingham campaign protests are not appropriate methods for achieving civil rights in Birmingham or achieving racial unity in Birmingham. Therefore, Birmingham's black residents should withdraw support for the Birmingham campaign and allow these grievances to be pursued in the courts and through negotiations among city and Negro leadership. In other words, the black leadership whom the clergy agree with, right? Because there's lots and lots of black community leaders in Birmingham who are on the streets with King protesting for desegregation. Okay, so here's King's counter argument. And he's got lots of them, but here's the first representation of his counter argument, right? On page 3, he writes, you deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I'm sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. Right? I'm sure that none of you would want to rest content with a superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with the effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. King continues with her counter-argument that relies on an argument from analogy. He says, in your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this something like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? We must come to see that, as the federal courts have consistently affirmed, it is wrong to urge an individual to cease his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest may precipitate violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. Okay, so what are the underlying causes in Birmingham that produced the undesirable effects of protest and racial friction? In other words, what are the causes of unrest that the clergy, the moderates, have wrongly omitted from their social analysis? So King briefly touches on this theme here, writing that Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation, right? So those are some of the underlying causes. And just think about how out of touch, to some extent, the clergy are when they refer to the problems in Birmingham as, quote, racial friction, right? It's a bit of a euphemism, when in fact what we have are bombings, fire bombings of black homes and families, right, that go unsolved, right? That's not racial friction, it's racial terror. And to refer to what's happening in Birmingham as racial friction reveals that one is not really facing down reality as it exists. And again, that's just the effect of being kind of white and insulated from the experiences of Black Americans, both today, but especially right in the 1960s. Now, King continues to address these underlying causes of the protest that the clergy emitted a few pages later in a very, very moving but sort of, harrowing passage read here by the actor James Earl Jones.
We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen the hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger and your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and when your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs., when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly on tiptoe stands, never quite knowing what to expect next, and plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of injustice where they experience the blackness of corroding despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience.
And there's, that was an excerpt, and there's one passage that was left out of that you might also remember from the reading. It's the one that sticks out the most to me. King says, as a part of those when statements, he says, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and then see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. Right? And so it's just, this has been kind of described as one of the most, important or beautiful run-on sentences in all of American literature. I think you can see why it's so powerful, the way that King actually is able to address the underlying causes, right, of the protest and the Black freedom struggle in Birmingham. All right, so the second characterization of the white moderates that forms part of King's counter-argument is that the white moderate is more devoted to order than to justice. And along with the fact that white moderates have never had to experience the stinging darts of racial subjugation, King indicates further reasons why the moderate settles for a superficial social analysis that deals merely with the effects of protest, right, racial friction, and the possibility of violence, but does not grapple with its underlying causes, injustice, and actually existing racist violence, right? And so those further causes King lays out in the middle of the letter on page 13. He says, I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his strive toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who consistently says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set a timetable for another man's freedom, and who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who consistently advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. So consider that first characterization, right? The white moderate is more devoted to order than to justice. If you care more about maintaining order than you care about ensuring justice in your society or in your community, then what's going to upset you the most? Is it going to be the disorder of the protest or the injustice of racial inequality and racial violence? Well, if you're more devoted to order than to justice, then what's really going to upset you is the disorder caused by the protest, right? And that's exactly what we see in the white moderate political analysis. And so King is making the argument that in caring more about order than justice, the white moderate has inverted a sort of value hierarchy. The moderates appear to value order over justice, but order is only valuable insofar as it can promote justice. And in Birmingham, the maintenance of law and order has actually become an obstacle to justice, right? And then to drive some of these points home, maybe think on these questions. Where is the clergy's public call for unity and call for peace after the KKK and mobs firebomb black churches and black homes? Right? Those calls for unity and calls for peace don't exist. Those calls for unity only come out right after people start protesting against the racial injustice. Right? Where is the clergy's call for law and order when the Birmingham City Fathers refused to desegregate its public schools 9 years after Brown v. Board of Education ruled that such segregation was unconstitutional? Right? Again, it's not that these white moderates have hate in their heart. It's perhaps more accurate to say that Jim Crow reality has produced within them a deep sort of racial ignorance. Okay. Next is King's critique that the white moderate prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And this argument, I think, has proved to be one of King's most important insights and contributions into our understanding of the decisive role of protest in luring out the contradictions of a society that proclaims at once both to be an equal society for all, but yet has underlying institutions that disproportionately distribute advantages to some groups over others. So, negative peace, King says, is the absence of tension. All right, so what does that mean? Well, I think one way to understand King's point here about negative peace and positive peace is by examining a really popular protest chant that some of you may recall from racial justice protests, like contemporary racial justice protests, right? And the chant is, "No justice, no peace." But not everyone clearly grasps what the phrase means, right? It's a conditional statement, and it means if there's no justice, then there will be no peace, right? What that means is that if justice is denied, then we will continue to erupt in protest and do away with the peace and quiet, right? The negative peace of the status quo, where oppressor and oppressed alike simply go along with the smooth flow of life, right? Having become well adjusted to injustice. And so when King argues that a negative peace is merely the absence of tension, the tension he means is the discomfort and disruption that results when the oppressed and the exploited take to the streets to demand the realization of their human rights and dignity. So to make sense out of this no justice, no peace framework here, I want us to consider the following hypothetical. So assume that, Philosophy 2020 was an in-person class. And assume that I, your instructor, forced all of my religious students to sit in the back of the classroom and prevented them from participating in class discussion, right? They are given extra work, and they are graded much more severely than my atheist or agnostic students. And the religious students, right, who are sitting in the back become the regular objects of insult, right? Now, if I arranged the class this way, that would be a big problem, right? It would be a miscarriage of justice. It would be an unjust organization of the class. And then assume further that I failed or withdrew from the class all of those religious students who tried to fight back, until the remaining religious students, now just a minority of 5 or 6 students, learned their place and kept their nose down for much of the remaining semester. Okay, next, imagine that my department chair came to evaluate my classroom one day, and because the religious students had stopped fighting back, there were no disruptions for him to witness, and I was able to continue my lectures in peace, right? The peace and quiet of my classroom is what King means by a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, right? There is no justice in my classroom, but neither is there any disorder because the religious students have learned their place, right, in that classroom. And so they're not causing any trouble for me. Now, finally, imagine that a few weeks later, the 5 remaining religious students decided to challenge the status quo of my classroom by disrupting my lectures, and they start chanting, "No justice, no lecture," right? No justice, no lecture. And they chant over me so that I can't actually deliver a lecture, right? Or facilitate a discussion with the other students. And so you can imagine the classroom is now the site of a protest. The classroom is full of discomfort and tension. But then some atheistic or agnostic students imagine that they are like shook to the core by these protests, and then they join the protests of their religious fellow students, while other atheist or agnostic students try to physically attack, right, the religious students who are protesting. And then all the while, imagine there are the moderate students, right, who are neither trying to attack the religious students, but neither joining them in protest, right? And these moderate students present themselves as the voice of reason and common sense. They don't throw their solidarity behind the demonstrators, but scold them and call both group of students unacceptable extremists, right? We need unity, the moderate student says, but your disruptive protests are just dividing our classroom further and creating the conditions for violence. So in Birmingham, right, to halt the protest movement and urge a return to peace, that is, a return to what King calls negative peace, simply means a return to the smooth flow of the status quo. And for black residents in Birmingham, a return to the status quo meant a return to indignity, a return to humiliation, a return to hopelessness and powerlessness, a return to resignation, a return to submission and racial subjugation. Okay, so that's it for this kind of second lecture. The third lecture will pick up on the rest of these counter arguments that King develops in response to the white moderates' arguments in a call for unity. Thanks.